The gaslit ballroom of Ashford House glittered like a jewelled box, its crystal chandeliers casting dancing shadows across the cream and gold walls, where London's most elite families gathered for the season's most anticipated event. Miss Vivian Hartwell stood at the edge of the glittering assembly, her gloved hands folded carefully at her waist, her posture perfect despite the tension that radiated through her slender frame. She had been waiting for precisely 23 minutes, not that she was counting, for His Grace the Duke of Blackmore to acknowledge her presence with more than the cold nod he had offered upon her arrival. The same cold nod that had become as familiar as breathing over the past 6 months of their peculiar arrangement. From across the room, Alexander Blackwood, Duke of Blackmore, watched her with the careful attention of a man who had trained himself to observe without appearing to care. She looked magnificent tonight in ivory silk that complemented her dark hair and pale skin, every inch the perfect lady he had insisted she become. What disturbed him was how much he wanted to cross the room and claim her, to show every man present that she belonged to him. A desire that went against every rule he had established for their relationship. Miss Vivian Hartwell was the daughter of a country gentleman whose recent death had left her family in reduced circumstances. What she concealed beneath her reputation for quiet dignity was a passionate nature that had been carefully suppressed by months of rigid training in the art of being a duke's secret mistress. She had agreed to his terms out of necessity, but she had never expected that the cold, controlled man who had purchased her compliance would come to mean so much to her heart. "Stay with me until the truth can no longer remain hidden." "Miss Hartwell appears to be unaccompanied this evening," observed Lady Pemberton, her voice carrying the particular tone that society matrons used when they scented scandal. "How unusual for such a young woman to attend without proper chaperonage." Alexander's jaw tightened imperceptibly at the comment, though he maintained his position near the windows, apparently absorbed in conversation with Lord Westbrook about parliamentary matters. He had heard the whispers, of course, speculation about Vivian's circumstances, her sudden appearance in London society, the mysterious benefactor who had apparently secured her modest but respectable lodgings in Bloomsbury. What society did not know, what he had taken great care to ensure they would never know, was that he was that benefactor. That 6 months ago, when Vivian's father had died leaving debts that would have seen her family turned out onto the streets, Alexander had offered her a devil's bargain. Become his mistress, and he would ensure her family's security. The arrangement had been coldly practical from the beginning. Alexander needed discretion above all else. His position, his reputation, his family's political influence, all depended on maintaining an image of moral rectitude. Vivienne needed financial security for herself and her younger sister. They had struck a bargain that satisfied both their needs while maintaining the appearance of propriety. "Don't touch me in public," had been his first and most important rule. "Don't look at me with anything more than polite acknowledgement. Don't give society any reason to connect us beyond the most casual acquaintance." Vivian had agreed to his terms, had learned to play the role of the respectable young lady who occasionally appeared at the same social events as the Duke of Blackmore, but had no particular connection to him. She had mastered the art of being invisible in plain sight, of moving through his world without leaving any trace of her true relationship to him. But tonight, something was different. Tonight, as Alexander watched her from across the room, he could see the strain in her carefully controlled posture, the way her smile never quite reached her eyes when she responded to the polite conversation of the other guests. "Your Grace," came a voice at his elbow, and Alexander turned to find Lord Pemberton approaching with his eldest son in tow. "May I present my son, Captain James Pemberton? He has recently returned from service in India." Alexander inclined his head politely to the young man, noting the way Captain Pemberton's eyes had already found Vivian across the room. "Captain, I trust you found your service educational." "Indeed, Your Grace, though I confess I am finding London society far more stimulating than I expected." Captain Pemberton's gaze lingered on Vivian with obvious appreciation. That young lady, for instance. Miss Hartwell, I believe? She has quite captured my attention. Alexander felt something cold and dangerous stir in his chest. Miss Hartwell is a respectable young woman, he said carefully. I am certain she would appreciate appropriate courtesy from any gentleman seeking her acquaintance. Of course, Your Grace. I would never presume otherwise. Captain Pemberton smiled with the confidence of a man accustomed to getting what he wanted. In fact, I was hoping you might provide an introduction, given your familiarity with London society. Nid, the request was perfectly reasonable, exactly the sort of social courtesy that Alexander would normally provide without hesitation. But the thought of introducing another man to Vivian, of watching her smile at someone else, of seeing her dance in another man's arms, filled him with a rage so intense it took all his self-control to maintain his composure. I fear I am not well acquainted with Miss Hartwell, Alexander lied smoothly. You would do better to ask our hostess for an introduction. As Captain Pemberton moved away to seek out Lady Ashford, Alexander found himself unable to look away from Vivian. She was speaking with Lady Morrison now, her head tilted attentively as she listened to some story about the woman's grandchildren. She looked serene, untouchable, perfectly proper, everything he had trained her to be. So why did he suddenly want to cross the room, take her in his arms, and show every person present that she belonged to him? The answer came to him with uncomfortable clarity. Because somewhere in the past 6 months, his carefully controlled arrangement had become something far more dangerous. Somewhere between their first awkward encounter and tonight's elegant performance, he had begun to care for Vivian Hartwell in ways that had nothing to do with physical desire and everything to do with the heart he had thought safely armored against such vulnerabilities. Across the room, Vivienne was acutely aware of Alexander's attention, despite his apparent indifference. She had learned to read the subtle signs of his moods, the way he held his shoulders when he was displeased, the slight tightening around his eyes when something troubled him, the particular stillness that came over him when he was fighting some internal battle. Tonight he seemed more tense than usual, though she could not fathom why. Their arrangement had been proceeding smoothly for months now. She played her role perfectly, never gave him cause for concern about discretion or propriety. Her family was secure, her sister safely enrolled in an excellent school, her own position in society carefully maintained through his anonymous support. So why did she feel as if something fundamental was about to change? Miss Hartwell. Lady Ashford appeared at her elbow with a young man in military uniform. May I present Captain Pemberton? He has expressed a desire to make your acquaintance. Vivian curtsied gracefully, noting the way Captain Pemberton's eyes lit with appreciation as they took in her appearance. He was handsome in a conventional way, with fair hair and blue eyes that suggested good humor and easy charm. Captain Pemberton, she said with the perfectly modulated warmth she had learned to deploy in social situations. How lovely to meet you. I understand you have recently returned from India? Indeed, Miss Hartwell, though I must say the beauties of the East pale in comparison to what I have found here in London. His compliment was smoothly delivered, accompanied by a smile that had undoubtedly charmed many ladies. Vivian felt herself responding to his obvious admiration despite her better judgment. It had been so long since a man had looked at her with open appreciation, since she had been allowed to engage in the simple pleasure of flirtation without calculating the political implications of every word and gesture. You flatter me, Captain, though I suspect you say the same to every lady you meet. On the contrary, Miss Hartwell, I am quite selective in my compliments. Captain Pemberton moved closer, lowering his voice to a more intimate register. I wonder if you might honor me with a dance. The next set appears to be forming. Vivian glanced across the room, her eyes finding Alexander automatically. He was deep in conversation with Lord Westbrook, apparently oblivious to her situation. For 6 months, she had waited for some sign that their arrangement meant more to him than mere convenience, some indication that he saw her as more than a well-trained mistress who knew how to maintain proper appearances. She had received nothing but cold courtesy and carefully maintained distance. "I would be delighted, Captain Pemberton," she said, placing her gloved hand on his offered arm. As they moved toward the dance floor, Vivian felt a flutter of rebellion in her chest. For once, she would allow herself to enjoy the simple pleasure of being admired, of dancing with a man who looked at her as if she were precious rather than merely convenient. From across the room, Alexander watched them take their positions for the quadrille with a growing sense of something that could only be described as murderous rage. Captain Pemberton was standing too close, smiling too warmly, looking at Vivian as if he had every right to her attention and affection. "Blackmore," Lord Westbrook said, following his gaze, "you look as if you're planning to call someone out. What has captured your attention so thoroughly?" Alexander forced himself to look away from the dance floor to focus on his companion's amused expression. "Nothing of consequence. You were saying about the reform bill?" But even as he attempted to resume their political discussion, Alexander's attention kept drifting back to the dance floor, where Vivian was moving through the figures of the quadrille with a grace and joy he had never seen her display in his presence. She was laughing at something Captain Pemberton had said, her face animated in a way that made Alexander's chest tight with emotions he refused to name. This was what he had wanted, he reminded himself. A mistress who could move through society without creating scandal, who could maintain the appearance of respectability while providing him with the companionship he required. He had no right to object if she attracted the attention of other men, no grounds for complaint if she chose to enjoy their admiration. But knowing that intellectually and accepting it emotionally were two entirely different things. "She's quite lovely," Lord Westbrook observed, his own gaze following Alexander's to the dance floor. "Miss Hartwell, I mean. Pemberton's boy seems quite taken with her." "Indeed," Alexander managed, his voice carefully neutral. "I understand she's recently come to London? Something about family circumstances requiring a change of residence?" Alexander nodded, not trusting himself to speak. He had crafted Vivian's backstory carefully, creating a plausible explanation for her presence in London society that would satisfy curiosity without inviting too much scrutiny. "Well, she seems to be settling in admirably, though I confess I'm surprised she hasn't attracted more serious attention before now. A young woman of her obvious qualities." Lord Westbrook let the observation hang in the air, clearly fishing for information about Vivian's romantic prospects. "Perhaps she has been too recently bereaved to consider such matters," Alexander said stiffly. "Ah, yes, her father's death. Tragic, of course, but these things must be faced practically. A young woman cannot remain in mourning forever, particularly one without significant fortune to ensure her independence." Lord Westbrook's tone was casual, but Alexander could hear the calculation beneath it. "I imagine she will be receiving offers soon enough. Pemberton's boy, for instance, seems quite serious in his attentions." Alexander felt his hands clench into fists at his sides. The thought of Vivian receiving offers, of considering marriage to another man, of leaving their arrangement to become some other man's wife, filled him with a possessive fury that shocked him with its intensity. "If you will excuse me," he said abruptly, "I believe I need some air." But instead of heading for the terrace, Alexander found himself moving toward the dance floor, drawn by a compulsion he could neither explain nor resist. The quadrille was ending, and he watched as Captain Pemberton bowed over Vivian's hand with obvious reluctance to let her go. "Miss Hartwell," Alexander said, appearing at her elbow with the silent grace that had become second nature to him. "I believe you promised me the next dance." It was a lie, of course. They had not spoken more than a dozen words to each other all evening, had maintained the careful distance that their arrangement required. But Vivian looked up at him with surprise that quickly gave way to something that might have been relief. "Your Grace," she said with a curtsy that was perfectly correct, but somehow seemed to carry undertones of challenge. "I was not aware that you danced." "On rare occasions," Alexander replied, extending his arm with the authority of a man accustomed to having his wishes obeyed. "When the music and the company are particularly inspiring." Captain Pemberton looked between them with obvious confusion, clearly sensing undercurrents he could not identify. "I say, Blackmore, I was rather hoping to claim Miss Hartwell for the waltz myself." "Were you indeed?" Alexander's voice carried just enough ice to make the younger man step back involuntarily. "How unfortunate that she is already engaged for this set." Vivienne felt her pulse quicken at the possessive note in Alexander's voice, at the way he was looking at her, as if he had every right to claim her attention. It was the first time in 6 months that he had shown any public sign of interest in her, the first crack in the carefully maintained facade of indifference. "Your Grace," she said carefully, "I would not wish to disappoint Captain Pemberton." "Captain Pemberton will survive the disappointment," Alexander said firmly, placing her hand on his arm with a proprietary gesture that sent shockwaves through the watching crowd. "Won't you, Captain?" It was not really a question, and Captain Pemberton was wise enough to recognize a dismissal when he heard one. "Of course, Your Grace. Perhaps another time, Miss Hartwell." As the opening notes of the waltz began, Alexander led Vivienne onto the dance floor with a confidence that suggested he had been planning this moment for far longer than the past few minutes. The watching crowd parted before them, whispers following in their wake as society tried to process this unexpected development. "Alexander," Vivienne said quietly as his arm came around her waist, "what are you doing? This goes against everything you said about maintaining distance in public." "I am claiming what is mine," Alexander replied, his voice low and intense as they began to move together. "I am tired of watching other men look at you as if they have the right to your attention." "But our arrangement, Alexander interrupted, his dark eyes burning into hers, "did not account for the possibility that I might come to care for you in ways that have nothing to do with convenience or discretion." Vivienne felt her breath catch at the admission, at the raw honesty in his voice. "Alexander, you cannot mean—" "I mean every word," he said, pulling her closer than propriety strictly allowed. "I mean that watching you dance with another man, seeing you smile at him the way you have never smiled at me, made me realize that I would rather face scandal than continue pretending that you mean nothing to me. At this moment, would you have told the truth?" The ballroom seemed to fade around them as they moved together, the whispers and stares of the watching crowd becoming irrelevant in the face of the electricity crackling between them. Vivienne had dreamed of this moment, had imagined what it would feel like to have Alexander look at her with something more than cold courtesy. But the reality was overwhelming. "What are you saying?" she whispered, her voice barely audible above the music. "I am saying that I love you," Alexander said, the words seeming to surprise him as much as they did her. "I am saying that 6 months of trying to keep you at arm's length has only made me realize how much I need you in my life, not as a mistress, not as a convenient arrangement, but as something far more precious." Vivienne felt tears gather in her eyes at the sincerity in his voice, at the vulnerability she could see in his expression. "But your reputation, your position, everything you said about the importance of discretion, means nothing without you," Alexander said firmly. "I would rather be a duke who married for love than one who lived his entire life afraid of what society might think." "Married?" Vivienne's voice cracked on the word. "If you will have me," Alexander said, his voice dropping to an intimate murmur that only she could hear. "If you can forgive me for the coldness I have shown you, for the rules I imposed, for treating you as if you were something to be hidden rather than cherished." The waltz was ending, but neither of them seemed inclined to step apart. They stood in the center of the dance floor, oblivious to the sensation they were creating, lost in a conversation that was changing the fundamental nature of their relationship. "Alexander," Vivienne said softly, "I need to know, is this real, or are you simply reacting to seeing me with another man?" "It is the most real thing I have ever felt," Alexander replied without hesitation. "Seeing you with Captain Pemberton only made me realize what I have been too proud and too foolish to acknowledge, that I love you, Vivienne, completely, desperately, without reservation." "And our arrangement?" The rules you insisted upon can go to hell, Alexander said, with a vehemence that made her gasp. I am tired of rules, tired of pretending, tired of denying what we both feel. I want to court you properly, Vivian. I want to marry you, to make you my duchess, to spend the rest of my life showing you how precious you are to me. Vivian looked into his eyes, seeing sincerity there, seeing love that matched her own hidden feelings. But she also saw the magnitude of what he was offering, the scandal it would create, the challenges they would face. The Tun will never accept it, she said quietly. A duke marrying his former mistress. It will be the scandal of the century. Then let it be, Alexander said fiercely. I would rather face scandal with you than live respectably without you. Vivian, you have shown me what it means to truly live, to feel something beyond duty and obligation. I will not give that up for the sake of society's approval. Before Vivian could respond, they were interrupted by the approach of Lady Ashford, whose expression suggested she was both fascinated and horrified by the spectacle they had created. Your Grace, Miss Hartwell, she said, with the bright smile of a hostess trying to manage a potentially explosive situation. What a lovely waltz. Perhaps you would care for some refreshment? Alexander looked around the ballroom for the first time since the dance began, noting the sea of curious faces, the whispered conversations, the obvious speculation about what they had just witnessed. He had created exactly the kind of scene he had spent 6 months trying to avoid, had thrown discretion to the wind in the most public way possible, and he found that he did not care in the slightest. Thank you, Lady Ashford, he said with perfect courtesy, but I believe Miss Hartwell and I have much to discuss. If you would excuse us? Without waiting for a response, Alexander offered Vivian his arm and led her from the dance floor, through the crowd of watching guests, and out onto the moonlit terrace where they could speak privately. Alexander, Vivian said as soon as they were alone, do you realize what you have just done? By tomorrow morning, all of London will be speculating about our relationship. Good, Alexander replied, turning to face her with an expression of fierce determination. Let them speculate, let them gossip, let them say whatever they please. I'm tired of hiding my feelings for you, tired of pretending that you mean nothing to me. But your family, your position, my family will adjust, Alexander said firmly. As for my position, what good is it if I cannot use it to protect and cherish the woman I love? Vivian felt her resistance crumbling in the face of his passionate declaration. For 6 months she had dreamed of hearing such words from him, had hoped against hope that their cold arrangement might someday become something warmer, something real. Are you certain? She asked softly. Are you certain you will not regret this when the scandal breaks, when society turns against us? Alexander stepped closer, close enough that she could see the gold flecks in his dark eyes, could feel the warmth radiating from his body. I am certain that I love you, Vivian Hartwell. I am certain that I want to spend the rest of my life with you. Everything else, scandal, gossip, society's disapproval, is merely noise. And if I say yes, if I agree to marry you, then you will make me the happiest man in England, Alexander said simply. You will give me something I never thought I would find. A love worth more than duty, more than position, more than all the expectations that have governed my life. Vivian looked into his eyes, seeing truth there, seeing a love that matched her own carefully hidden feelings. The practical part of her mind catalogued all the reasons why this was impossible, all the obstacles they would face, all the ways it could end in disaster. But her heart, the heart she had guarded so carefully for 6 months, whispered that some things were worth any risk. Yes, she said softly. Yes, Alexander, I will marry you. The joy that flooded Alexander's face was like sunlight breaking through storm clouds. He pulled her into his arms then, holding her close as if he would never let her go. And when he kissed her, it was with all the passion and tenderness that had been building between them for months. I love you, he whispered against her lips. I love you, and I will spend the rest of my life proving it to you. As they stood together on the moonlit terrace, holding each other close while the sounds of the ball continued inside, Vivian marveled at how completely her life had changed in the space of a single dance. She had entered the ballroom as a duke's secret mistress, bound by rules and restrictions that kept her forever in the shadows. She would leave it as his acknowledged love, his chosen bride, his future duchess. The transformation was so dramatic, so unexpected, that she could barely believe it was real. But the strength of Alexander's arms around her, the sincerity in his voice, the love shining in his eyes, all of it convinced her that this was no dream, but the beginning of a new chapter in their story. A chapter written not by duty or convenience, but by love. The morning after Lady Ashford's ball brought a deluge of visitors to Vivian's modest lodgings in Bloomsbury, all eager to satisfy their curiosity about the extraordinary scene they had witnessed the previous evening. Vivian received them in her small drawing room, acutely aware that every word she spoke would be dissected and repeated throughout London society within hours. "My dear Miss Hartwell," gushed Mrs. Pemberton, her eyes bright with the hunger for gossip, "you simply must tell us everything. The Duke of Blackmore's attentions last evening were so marked. How long have you been acquainted?" Vivian had spent the sleepless night preparing for such questions, crafting responses that would satisfy curiosity without revealing the true nature of her relationship with Alexander. "His Grace and I have been acquainted for some months," she said carefully, "though our friendship has developed gradually." "Friendship?" Mrs. Pemberton's laugh was sharp with disbelief. "My dear girl, no man looks at a woman the way Blackmore was looking at you last night and calls it mere friendship." There was something quite possessive in his manner. Heat flooded Vivian's cheeks at the observation, but she maintained her composure. "His Grace has been most kind to me during a difficult period following my father's death." "Kind indeed," murmured Lady Morrison, her tone suggesting she found the explanation insufficient. "Though I confess myself surprised by the suddenness of his interest. Blackmore has always been so careful about his associations, so particular about maintaining proper distance from unmarried ladies." Indeed, the comment hit closer to the truth than Vivian was comfortable with, reminding her of the careful rules Alexander had imposed on their relationship, rules he had shattered so dramatically the night before. "Perhaps," she said quietly, "His Grace simply felt it was time to be more open about his feelings." Before the conversation could become more probing, Vivian was saved by the arrival of Alexander himself, who was announced with the ceremony due to his rank. The ladies in her drawing room immediately rose to curtsy, their expressions a mixture of excitement and calculation as they assessed this unexpected development. "Your Grace," Vivian said, rising to greet him with what she hoped appeared to be appropriate pleasure rather than the relief she actually felt. "How kind of you to call." "Miss Hartwell," Alexander replied, his voice carrying a warmth that had been notably absent from their public interactions for the past 6 months. "I hope I'm not intruding. I wish to inquire about your health after last evening's festivities." The way he said festivities suggested he was well aware of the speculation their dance had created and that he was prepared to face the consequences of his actions. "I am quite well, thank you," Vivian replied, gesturing for him to take a seat. "I was just entertaining some callers who were kind enough to express their concern for my welfare." Alexander's gaze swept the room, taking in the avid faces of the assembled ladies, the barely concealed excitement at finding themselves witnesses to what was clearly a significant development in his relationship with Vivian. "How thoughtful," he said with perfect courtesy, though Vivian could detect the subtle irony in his tone. "I trust they have been supportive during this period of adjustment." "Indeed, Your Grace," Mrs. Pemberton said quickly, clearly hoping to insert herself into the conversation. "We were just discussing how sudden your interest in Miss Hartwell appears to be. Not that there is anything improper in that, of course, but one cannot help but be curious about the development of such an attachment." Alexander's expression grew cooler at the barely veiled fishing expedition. "I fear there is nothing mysterious about it, Mrs. Pemberton. Miss Hartwell and I have been acquainted for some time, and I have come to value her many qualities. Last evening simply seemed an appropriate time to make my regard more public." "And what qualities might those be, Your Grace?" Lady Morrison asked with the boldness of a woman who had known Alexander since childhood. "We are all quite curious to understand what has captured the attention of London's most eligible bachelor." Vivian felt her cheeks burn with embarrassment at the directness of the question, but Alexander answered without hesitation. "Miss Hartwell possesses intelligence, grace, and a strength of character that I find inspiring," he said, his gaze finding Vivian's across the room. "She has faced adversity with dignity, maintained her principles despite difficult circumstances, and shown a kindness of heart that is all too rare in our society." The sincerity in his voice, the way he looked at her as he spoke, sent warmth flooding through Vivian's chest. These were not the careful compliments of a man playing a social role, but the honest assessment of someone who truly knew and valued her. "How romantic," Mrs. Pemberton sighed, though her eyes remained sharp with curiosity. "And may we hope for further developments in this attachment?" It was an outrageously direct question, one that pushed the boundaries of social propriety, but Alexander answered it with the confidence of a man who had made his decision and was prepared to defend it. "I believe Miss Hartwell and I understand each other quite well," he said calmly. "As for the future, time will tell." After the visitors finally departed, leaving them alone in Vivian's modest drawing room, Alexander's formal demeanor softened into something more genuine. "I apologize for that interrogation," he said, moving to stand beside her chair. "I had not anticipated quite such enthusiasm for our affairs." "It is to be expected," Vivian replied, though she felt drained by the careful performance she had been required to maintain. "Your behavior last night was so contrary to your usual manner that people are bound to speculate." "And do you regret it? The speculation, the attention, the inevitable gossip?" Vivian considered his question seriously. "The attention was overwhelming, the scrutiny uncomfortable, but when she thought of the alternative, returning to their cold arrangement, pretending that last night's revelations had never occurred, she knew her answer. "No," she said softly, "I do not regret it, though I confess I am uncertain about how to proceed from here." Alexander knelt beside her chair, taking her hands in his with a tenderness that still surprised her after months of careful distance. "We proceed by being honest about our feelings, by courting properly, by building the foundation for a marriage based on love rather than convenience. And the scandal? The talk about your association with a woman of questionable circumstances?" Alexander's expression grew fierce. "Anyone who questions your character will answer to me personally. You are not a woman of questionable circumstances, Vivienne. You are a lady who made difficult choices to protect her family, who maintained her dignity despite impossible situations, who deserves to be honored rather than judged. But Alexander, you know as well as I do that society will not see it that way. They will say that you have been compromised by a designing woman, that I have somehow trapped you into this attachment." "Then they will be wrong," Alexander said firmly, "and I will take great pleasure in correcting their misconceptions." Before Vivian could respond, they were interrupted by the arrival of her maid with a message that had just been delivered. "From Lady Blackmore, miss," the maid said with obvious nervousness. "She requests the honor of your presence for tea this afternoon." Vivian felt her heart sink as she read the formal invitation. Alexander's mother, the Dowager Duchess of Blackmore, was one of society's most formidable figures, a woman whose approval could make or break a reputation. "She knows," Vivian said quietly, handing the invitation to Alexander. "About last night, about us. She wants to assess the damage." Alexander read the invitation with a grim expression. "My mother has always been direct in her approach to family matters, but Vivian, you must understand, her opinion, while important to me personally, will not change my feelings for you or my intention to marry you." But it will make our life together much more difficult if she disapproves. Perhaps, Alexander agreed. But it will also be much more difficult if I spend the rest of my life regretting that I let fear prevent me from claiming the woman I love. That afternoon, Vivian dressed with particular care for her meeting with the Dowager Duchess, choosing a gown of deep blue silk that was elegant without being ostentatious, fashionable without being frivolous. She had met Lady Blackmore briefly on several social occasions, but always in the context of large gatherings where individual attention was minimal. This would be entirely different. A private interview that would determine whether Alexander's family would accept her or spend the rest of their lives trying to undermine their marriage. Blackmore House was everything Vivian had expected, imposing, elegant, and intimidating in its grandeur. She was shown into a drawing room that spoke of centuries of wealth and privilege, where the Dowager Duchess waited with the regal bearing of a woman accustomed to command. "Miss Hartwell," Lady Blackmore said, rising to greet her with perfect courtesy. "How kind of you to accept my invitation on such short notice." "Your Grace," Vivian replied, offering a curtsy that she hoped struck the right balance between respect and dignity. "The honor is entirely mine." "Please, be seated," the Dowager Duchess said, gesturing to a chair positioned to catch the afternoon light, a deliberate choice that would allow her to study Vivian's expressions closely. "I trust you are well. Last evening's excitement must have been quite overwhelming." Vivian recognized the opening gambit for what it was, a polite inquiry that was actually a probe for information about her feelings and intentions. "I am quite well, thank you, though I confess the attention has been unexpected. Indeed, my son has always been most careful about his public associations. His behavior last evening was quite unprecedented." Lady Blackmore's tone was neutral, but Vivian could sense the sharp intelligence behind her assessment. "I confess myself curious about what prompted such a dramatic departure from his usual discretion." It was a trap, Vivian realized. If she claimed ignorance of Alexander's motives, she would appear naive or dishonest. If she admitted to understanding them, she would be acknowledging the depth of their relationship. "I believe His Grace felt it was time to be more open about his feelings," she said carefully, echoing her earlier response to similar questions. "His feelings," Lady Blackmore repeated thoughtfully. "And what of your feelings, Miss Hartwell? Are they equally developed?" The directness of the question caught Vivian off guard, but she met the older woman's gaze steadily. "I have great respect and affection for your son, Your Grace. He has shown me kindness during a difficult period in my life." "Kindness," the Dowager Duchess mused. "Yes, Alexander has always been kind to those in need of assistance, though I suspect his interest in you goes rather beyond mere charitable impulses." Vivian felt heat rise in her cheeks, but maintained her composure. "I would not presume to speculate about His Grace's motivations." "Would you not? How diplomatic." Lady Blackmore poured tea with the precise movements of a woman who had been performing such rituals for decades. "Tell me, Miss Hartwell, what do you know of the responsibilities that come with being a duchess?" The question was clearly a test, an assessment of whether Vivian understood what she would be taking on if she married Alexander. "I understand that it involves significant social obligations, the management of multiple households, and the responsibility of representing the family's interests in various charitable and political endeavors." "A textbook answer," Lady Blackmore observed, with what might have been approval, "but the reality is far more complex. A duchess must be prepared to sacrifice her personal desires for the good of the family, to endure scrutiny and criticism with grace, to support her husband's position even when it conflicts with her own preferences." "I understand that marriage requires compromise and mutual support," Vivian replied carefully. "Does it indeed? And are you prepared to make such compromises, to subordinate your own wishes to the needs of the dukedom?" Vivian sensed that this was the crucial moment, the point at which she must either defend her right to Alexander's love or accept dismissal as unsuitable for his position. "Your Grace," she said quietly, "I believe that a successful marriage requires partners who support each other's growth and happiness, not one who subordinates herself completely to the other's will. I would hope to be a duchess who enhances your son's life rather than diminishes it, who brings strength to his position rather than weakness." Lady Blackmore studied her for a long moment, her expression unreadable. "And you believe you possess such strength?" "I believe I possess the determination to learn, the intelligence to adapt, and the love necessary to make your son happy," Vivian replied with quiet confidence. "Whether that constitutes sufficient strength is for others to judge." "Indeed it is," the Dowager Duchess said. Then unexpectedly she smiled, a genuine expression of warmth that transformed her austere features. "Miss Hartwell, I have spent the past 24 hours investigating your background, your character, and your circumstances. What I have discovered has impressed me greatly." Vivienne felt her breath catch. "Your Grace, you have managed your family's crisis with remarkable skill, maintained your dignity despite reduced circumstances, and earned the respect of everyone who has dealt with you during this difficult period. These are not the actions of a weak woman or a fortune hunter, but of someone with genuine strength of character. I thank you, Your Grace. Furthermore," Lady Blackmore continued, "I have not seen my son so animated, so genuinely happy in years. Whatever has developed between you has clearly been beneficial to his emotional well-being." Vivian felt tears of relief gather in her eyes. "Does this mean, that is, would you accept?" "I would welcome you into this family," Lady Blackmore said firmly. "Not because you are perfect, no one is, but because you clearly love my son and he loves you. In my experience, that is the only foundation upon which a successful marriage can be built." As Vivian left Blackmore House that afternoon, her heart light with relief and joy, she reflected on how much had changed in less than 24 hours. She had entered Lady Ashford's ball as a duke's secret mistress, bound by rules that kept her forever in the shadows. She was leaving the Dowager Duchess's drawing room as Alexander's acknowledged future bride, accepted by his family and preparing for a life she had never dared to dream possible. But even as she celebrated this victory, Vivian knew that their greatest challenges still lay ahead. Society's acceptance would not come as easily as his mother's, and there would be those who would never forgive Alexander for choosing love over duty, passion over propriety. The game had changed, but it was far from over. The announcement of their engagement in the Times 3 days later created exactly the sensation Alexander had anticipated. London society erupted in a frenzy of speculation, gossip, and barely concealed scandal as the Ton struggled to process the news that one of England's most eligible bachelors had chosen to marry a woman of modest circumstances and questionable background. "The Duke of Blackmore and Miss Vivian Hartwell," read the formal notice, "announce their engagement with the blessing of their families. The wedding will take place in the autumn at St. George's, Hanover Square." Vivian read the announcement over breakfast in her lodgings, still hardly able to believe that her name was linked so publicly with Alexander's, that their secret relationship had been transformed into something society was forced to acknowledge and accept. But acceptance, she soon discovered, was not universal. The first sign of serious opposition came in the form of a visit from Lord Pemberton, who arrived at her lodgings with the grim determination of a man on a mission of utmost importance. "Miss Hartwell," he said without preamble once they were alone in her drawing room, "I believe we need to discuss your situation with the Duke of Blackmore." Vivian felt a chill of foreboding at his tone. "I am not certain what you mean, Lord Pemberton. My engagement to His Grace is a matter of public record." "Indeed it is, which is precisely why I felt compelled to call upon you." Lord Pemberton settled into his chair with the air of a man preparing for a lengthy and unpleasant conversation. "Miss Hartwell, I'm going to speak plainly because I believe you deserve to understand the full implications of what you are contemplating. I am listening." Your engagement to Blackmore is causing considerable distress among certain members of society. There are those who feel that his choice is inappropriate, given your circumstances and background. Vivian felt her temper rise at the barely veiled insult. And what circumstances might those be, Lord Pemberton? Come now, Miss Hartwell. We both know that your sudden appearance in London society, your mysterious means of support, your lack of proper chaperonage, all of it suggests a situation that is irregular. Are you accusing me of impropriety? I'm suggesting that there are aspects of your relationship with Blackmore that predate your public engagement, aspects that certain people are prepared to investigate and expose if necessary. The threat was clear, and Vivian felt her blood turn cold. Someone suspected the truth about her arrangement with Alexander, and they were prepared to use that knowledge to destroy their engagement. What exactly are you suggesting, Lord Pemberton? I am suggesting that you withdraw from this engagement voluntarily before information comes to light that would be damaging to both you and Blackmore. There are those who believe that the Duke has been compromised by a designing woman, and they are prepared to prove it. And if I refuse? Lord Pemberton's smile was cold. Then I fear you will discover just how unforgiving society can be when it feels that its most sacred institutions have been threatened. After Lord Pemberton left, Vivian sat alone in her drawing room, her mind racing through the implications of his visit. Someone, possibly several someones, knew about her true relationship with Alexander, and they were prepared to expose it unless she withdrew from their engagement. The scandal would destroy them both. Alexander would be seen as a man who had elevated his mistress to the position of duchess, while she would be branded as a scheming woman who had trapped a duke through improper means. But even as she contemplated the consequences of exposure, Vivian found herself unwilling to simply surrender the happiness she had found with Alexander. They had come too far, risked too much, to give up now without a fight. Her resolve was strengthened when Alexander arrived that afternoon, his expression grim with news of his own. I have been warned, he said without preamble, that certain members of society are planning to interfere with our engagement. Lord Pemberton paid me a visit this morning, Vivian said quietly. He suggested that I withdraw voluntarily before damaging information comes to light. Alexander's expression grew thunderous. What damaging information? The truth about our arrangement, I assume. Someone suspects that our relationship predates our public engagement, that there was something improper about our association. And what did you tell him? Nothing. But Alexander, if they can prove that I was your mistress before becoming your fiancé, the scandal will destroy us both. Alexander moved to the window, staring out at the London street with the air of a man calculating his options. Let them try, he said finally. Let them investigate, let them gossip, let them do their worst. I will not give you up, Vivian. Not for scandal, not for society's approval, not for anything. But the consequences will be whatever they are, Alexander interrupted firmly. Vivienne, do you love me? You know I do. And I love you. That is the only truth that matters. Everything else, gossip, speculation, social disapproval, is merely noise. Before Vivienne could respond, they were interrupted by the arrival of Alexander's friend, Lord Westbrook, whose expression suggested he brought news of considerable importance. Blackmore, he said grimly, we have a problem. A serious one. What sort of problem? Lady Catherine Pemberton has returned to London, Lord Westbrook said, his tone suggesting this was not good news. And she has been making some very interesting claims about your relationship with Miss Hartwell. Vivian felt her heart sink. Lady Catherine Pemberton was Lord Pemberton's daughter, a woman whose previous engagement to Alexander had ended in scandal when it was discovered that she was already married to another man. What sort of claims? Alexander asked, though his voice suggested he already suspected the answer. She is telling anyone who will listen that Miss Hartwell was your mistress long before your engagement was announced, that the entire courtship was a fabrication designed to cover up an improper relationship. Lord Westbrook's expression was apologetic but determined. She claims to have evidence, Alexander. Letters, witnesses, financial records that prove Miss Hartwell was under your protection for months before your engagement. Vivian felt the room spin around her. If Lady Catherine could prove their previous arrangement, if she had documentation of the financial support Alexander had provided, the scandal would be devastating. What evidence? Alexander asked quietly. She claims to have copies of bank drafts made out to Miss Hartwell's landlord, paid from your personal account. She also says she has testimony from servants who observed your visits to Miss Hartwell's lodgings during the period when you were supposedly unacquainted. Alexander was quiet for a long moment, his expression thoughtful rather than panicked. And what does Lady Catherine want in exchange for her silence? She wants you back, Lord Westbrook said bluntly. She wants you to break your engagement to Miss Hartwell and resume your previous understanding with her. Apparently, her first husband's death has freed her to marry again, and she believes you owe her the opportunity to become a duchess. Absolutely not, Alexander said without hesitation. I would rather face scandal than marry Catherine Pemberton. Even if the alternative is the complete destruction of your reputation and Miss Hartwell's. Alexander looked at Vivian, seeing the fear and uncertainty in her expression, the way she was struggling to process the magnitude of the threat they faced. Vivian, he said quietly, I need you to know that whatever happens, whatever Lady Catherine reveals or claims to reveal, my feelings for you will not change. I love you, and I want to marry you, regardless of the consequences. But Alexander, Vivian said, her voice breaking slightly, if she can prove that I was your mistress, the scandal will follow us for the rest of our lives. Your children will grow up with the whispers, the speculation about their mother's past. Then we will teach them that love is more important than gossip, that character matters more than reputation. And if society refuses to accept me, if I become a liability to your position, your influence, your family's standing. Alexander moved to kneel beside her chair, taking her hands in his with infinite tenderness. Then society will have to adjust. Vivienne, I would rather be a duke married to the woman he loves than one who sacrificed his happiness for the approval of people whose opinions ultimately mean nothing. Lord Westbrook cleared his throat diplomatically. While I admire your romantic sentiments, Alexander, I think you should consider the practical implications of this situation. Lady Catherine's accusations, if proven, could affect more than just your personal happiness. Your political influence, your family's business interests, your ability to move effectively in society, all of it could be compromised. And what would you suggest? Alexander asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. I would suggest that you consider Lady Catherine's proposal. Break the engagement to Miss Hartwell, marry Catherine as originally planned, and avoid the scandal entirely. Never, Alexander said flatly. Alexander, Vivian said quietly, perhaps Lord Westbrook is right. Perhaps the cost of our happiness is too high. Alexander's hands tightened on hers. The cost of giving you up would be higher. Vivienne, I have spent my entire life doing what was expected of me, fulfilling duties and obligations that others imposed upon me. For once, I want to choose something for myself. I want to choose you, even if it destroys everything you have worked to build. What I have worked to build means nothing without you to share it with. As they sat together in Vivienne's modest drawing room, facing the greatest crisis of their relationship, both of them understood that they had reached a crossroads. They could surrender to the pressure, allow fear and social convention to dictate their choices, and spend the rest of their lives regretting what they had given up. Or they could fight for their love, face whatever consequences came, and trust that their feelings for each other were strong enough to weather any storm. The choice, ultimately, was theirs to make. But as Vivian looked into Alexander's eyes, seeing the love and determination there, she knew what her answer would be. She would not give up the man she loved without a fight. The confrontation came sooner than expected. 2 days after Lord Westbrook's warning, Lady Catherine Pemberton requested a private meeting with Alexander and Vivian, claiming she had a proposition that would resolve their difficulties to everyone's satisfaction. They met in the neutral territory of Lord Westbrook's library, with him serving as witness to whatever arrangement might be proposed. Lady Catherine arrived precisely on time, dressed in elegant black silk that emphasized her pale beauty and carrying a leather portfolio that presumably contained the evidence she claimed to possess. "Blackmore," she said with a curtsy that was perfectly correct but notably cool. "Miss Hartwell, how kind of you to agree to this meeting." "Catherine," Alexander replied with equal formality, "I understand you have concerns about our engagement that you wish to discuss." "Concerns, yes, though I prefer to think of them as opportunities for mutual benefit." Lady Catherine settled into her chair with the confidence of a woman who believed she held all the winning cards. "You see, I find myself in a rather unique position. I possess information that could destroy both of your reputations, but I also have the power to ensure that information never becomes public." "And what would you require in exchange for your discretion?" Alexander asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. "I require justice," Lady Catherine said simply. "I require that you honor the commitment you made to me before you became distracted by other considerations. Our engagement was broken by mutual consent when it was discovered that you were already married." Alexander replied coldly, "I owe you nothing. Do you not? Because I have here documentation that suggests your relationship with Miss Hartwell began long before our engagement was dissolved." Lady Catherine opened her portfolio and withdrew a sheaf of papers. "Bank drafts, lease agreements, witness statements, all proving that Miss Hartwell was under your protection while you were still engaged to me." Vivian felt her blood turn cold as she recognized some of the documents, financial arrangements that Alexander had made on her behalf, carefully disguised but apparently not carefully enough to escape Lady Catherine's investigation. "Furthermore," Lady Catherine continued, "I have testimony from several servants who observed your visits to Miss Hartwell's lodgings, visits that occurred with suspicious regularity for a man who was supposedly engaged to another woman." "What exactly are you proposing?" Alexander asked, his voice carefully controlled. "I am proposing that you break your engagement to Miss Hartwell and resume your engagement to me. In exchange, these documents will be destroyed, and no word of Miss Hartwell's irregular circumstances will ever reach the public." "And if I refuse?" Lady Catherine's smile was cold as winter. "Then I will ensure that every newspaper in London receives copies of this evidence. The scandal will destroy Miss Hartwell's reputation completely, and yours will suffer considerably as well. You will be seen as a man who kept a mistress while engaged to another woman, who elevated that mistress to the position of duchess through deception and manipulation." The threat hung in the air like a sword waiting to fall. Vivian could see the calculation in Alexander's eyes, the way he was weighing their options, considering the consequences of each possible choice. "There is, of course, a third option," Lady Catherine continued smoothly. "Miss Hartwell could withdraw from the engagement voluntarily, claiming that she has realized the impossible. Miss Hartwell could withdraw from the engagement voluntarily, claiming that she has realized the impossibility of their union due to differences in station," Lady Catherine continued smoothly. "In that case, I would be willing to overlook certain irregularities in exchange for your eventual return to our previous understanding." Vivian felt the trap closing around them with inexorable precision. Lady Catherine had anticipated every possible response, prepared for every contingency. The evidence she possessed would indeed destroy them both if it became public, and there seemed to be no honorable way to escape her demands. "You seem to have given this considerable thought," Alexander said quietly, his voice betraying none of the emotion Vivian knew he must be feeling. "I have had ample time to consider my options since my Unfortunate widowhood freed me to pursue my original plans, Lady Catherine replied. I believe my proposal is quite reasonable, given the circumstances. Reasonable? Vivian spoke for the first time since the meeting began, her voice sharp with indignation. You call blackmail reasonable? I call it justice, Lady Catherine said coolly. You have taken something that rightfully belonged to me, Miss Hartwell. I am simply seeking to reclaim what is mine. Alexander is not property to be claimed, Vivian said fiercely. He is a man with the right to choose his own future, his own happiness. Is he indeed? Because from where I sit, it appears that his choices have been rather limited by circumstances of your creation. Lady Catherine's smile was poisonous. Tell me, Miss Hartwell, did you plan from the beginning to trap the Duke into marriage? Did you calculate exactly how to transform your position from mistress to duchess? That is enough, Alexander said, his voice carrying a warning that made Lady Catherine step back involuntarily. You will not speak to my fiancé in such terms. Your fiancé, Lady Catherine repeated mockingly. How touching that you still maintain that fiction. But we all know the truth, don't we? Miss Hartwell was your mistress long before she was your fiancé, and the only question now is whether that truth becomes public knowledge. Alexander rose from his chair, his presence suddenly radiating the kind of controlled power that reminded everyone present exactly who they were dealing with. Lady Catherine, you have made your position clear. Now allow me to make mine equally clear. I am listening. I will not break my engagement to Miss Hartwell. I will not resume any understanding with you. And if you attempt to use this alleged evidence against either of us, you will discover that I am not without resources of my own. Lady Catherine's confidence faltered slightly. What do you mean? I mean that I have spent considerable time investigating your own circumstances since your return to London. Your first husband's death, for instance, was remarkably convenient, occurring just as his debts had reached the point where they threatened to destroy your family's reputation. How dare you suggest— I suggest nothing, Alexander interrupted smoothly. I merely observe that a man in perfect health does not typically die so suddenly, so conveniently, leaving behind such a substantial insurance settlement. I also observe that you were present at his bedside when he expired, alone with him for several hours before his death was discovered. Lady Catherine's face went white. You cannot possibly be implying that I would— I imply nothing, but I imagine society would find the circumstances interesting, particularly when combined with the testimony of certain servants who observed your attentiveness to your husband's medication during his final illness. The accusation hung in the air like a thunderclap. Vivian stared at Alexander in shock, realizing that he was suggesting Lady Catherine had murdered her first husband for his insurance money. You have no proof, Lady Catherine said, but her voice lacked its earlier confidence. Do I not? Alexander moved to the desk and withdrew his own portfolio. I have here the testimony of a nurse who attended your husband during his final days, a woman who found it unusual that you insisted on administering his medication personally. I also have the report of a physician who questioned the sudden nature of his decline, given his previously robust health. That proves nothing. Perhaps not. But combined with the financial records showing your family's desperate circumstances before his death and the substantial insurance settlement that followed, well, I imagine the authorities would find it worth investigating. Lady Catherine was silent for a long moment, her mind clearly racing through the implications of Alexander's counter-threat. You would destroy me to protect your arrangement with that woman. I would protect the woman I love from anyone who threatens her, regardless of the consequences, Alexander said firmly. The question is whether you are prepared to face those consequences yourself. This is madness, Lady Catherine said desperately. You would risk everything, your reputation, your position, your family's standing, for a woman who was your mistress. I would risk everything for the woman who is going to be my wife, Alexander corrected. And if you attempt to prevent that marriage, you will discover exactly what I am prepared to do to protect her. Lady Catherine looked between them, seeing the determination in Alexander's face, the love and loyalty in Vivian's expression. Slowly, she began to gather her papers, her movements suggesting defeat rather than retreat. "This is not over," she said finally. "You may have silenced me, but there are others who know the truth, others who will not be so easily discouraged. Then they will face the same choice you are facing now," Alexander said calmly. "They can accept our marriage and move on with their lives, or they can discover what happens when they threaten something I value." After Lady Catherine left, Vivian and Alexander sat in silence for several minutes, both processing what had just occurred. The immediate threat had been neutralized, but at a cost that neither had anticipated. "Alexander," Vivian said finally, "what you suggested about Lady Catherine's husband, was it true?" "I believe it was," Alexander replied quietly. "The evidence is circumstantial, but compelling. Her husband's death was remarkably convenient, and the circumstances surrounding it raise serious questions. And you would really have exposed her to protect you?" Without hesitation, Alexander moved to sit beside her, taking her hands in his. "Vivian, I need you to understand something. I will not allow anyone to destroy our happiness, to force us apart through threats or blackmail. Whatever it takes, whatever the cost, I will protect what we have built together, even if it means becoming the kind of man who destroys others to get what he wants." Alexander was quiet for a moment, considering her question. "I hope it never comes to that, but if the choice is between our happiness and the welfare of people who would destroy us, yes, I would choose us." The admission troubled Vivian, even as she understood the love that motivated it. And what if there are others? What if Lady Catherine was right, and there are people who know the truth about our arrangement? "Then we will face them together," Alexander said firmly. "But Vivian, I think it's time we stopped running from the truth, stopped allowing others to use our past against us." "What do you mean?" Alexander stood and moved to the window, gazing out at the London street with the air of a man making a momentous decision. "I mean that perhaps we should tell our own story, control our own narrative rather than allowing others to control it for us." "Tell our story how?" "By being honest about how we met, how our relationship developed, how we fell in love despite the circumstances that brought us together." Alexander turned back to face her, his expression intense with conviction. "Society loves a romance, Vivian. If we present our story as a love that overcame obstacles rather than a scandal to be hidden, they may be more forgiving than we expect. You want to admit publicly that I was your mistress. I want to admit publicly that you were a woman in desperate circumstances who accepted my protection, and that in the process of providing that protection, I fell deeply in love with you." Alexander's voice grew warmer, more passionate. "I want to tell them that what began as a practical arrangement became the greatest love of my life." Vivian felt tears gather in her eyes at the sincerity in his voice, at the courage it would take to make such an admission. "And if society rejects us? If they refuse to accept such an unconventional beginning? Then we will build our own society," Alexander said simply. "We will surround ourselves with people who value love over convention, who understand that the heart does not always follow the rules that others set for it." "You would really do that? Give up your position in society for me?" "I would give up everything for you," Alexander said without hesitation, "but I don't think it will come to that. I think there are more people than we realize who understand that love is worth fighting for, worth defending against those who would destroy it for their own purposes." Before Vivian could respond, Lord Westbrook returned to the library, his expression suggesting he had news of considerable importance. "I apologize for the interruption," he said, "but I thought you should know. Lady Catherine has just been seen boarding a carriage bound for Dover. It appears she is leaving London rather suddenly." Alexander and Vivian exchanged glances. "Leaving? But she seemed so determined to pursue her threats." "Perhaps she decided that discretion was the better part of valor," Lord Westbrook suggested. "Or perhaps she realized that her own position was more precarious than she had initially calculated." Or perhaps, Alexander said thoughtfully, she received some additional information that made her reconsider her options. Whatever the reason for Lady Catherine's sudden departure, her absence removed the immediate threat to their engagement. But as they prepared to leave Lord Westbrook's house, Vivian realized that their troubles were far from over. "Alexander," she said, as their carriage rolled through the London streets, "even if Lady Catherine is gone, the questions about our relationship remain. People will still wonder, still speculate about how we really met, how our attachment developed." "Then perhaps it's time to give them the truth," Alexander said. "Not the sordid version that our enemies would prefer, but the real truth, that two people found each other in difficult circumstances and discovered that love was stronger than convention. And how do you propose we do that?" Alexander smiled, and Vivian saw in his expression the same determination that had driven him to claim her so publicly at Lady Ashford's ball. "We tell our story, Vivian. We tell it honestly, completely, and with pride rather than shame. We show society that love can triumph over any obstacle, including the ones they place in its path." That evening, Alexander sat in his study, composing a letter that would change everything. It was addressed to the editor of the Times, and it contained a full and honest account of his relationship with Vivian, how they had met, how their arrangement had developed, and how it had transformed into the deepest love of his life. "To the editor," he wrote, "I feel compelled to address certain rumors and speculations that have arisen regarding my engagement to Miss Vivian Hartwell. Rather than allow others to control the narrative of our relationship, I choose to tell our story myself, with honesty and without apology. Miss Hartwell and I met during a period of great difficulty in her life, when the death of her father had left her family in reduced circumstances. I offered her my protection not out of any improper motive, but because I recognized in her a woman of exceptional character who deserved better than the fate that circumstances had imposed upon her. What began as a practical arrangement designed to ensure her family's security gradually became something far more precious. In Miss Hartwell, I found not only a woman of remarkable beauty and intelligence, but a partner whose strength of character and depth of feeling matched my own. I fell in love with her completely, honestly, and without reservation. I am aware that some will find our unconventional beginning scandalous, that there are those who believe a duke should marry only within the narrow confines of what society deems appropriate. To those critics, I say this: I would rather be a man who married for love than one who sacrificed his happiness on the altar of convention. Miss Hartwell has agreed to become my wife, not because of my title or my fortune, but because she loves the man I am beneath those external trappings. In return, I love her not despite her circumstances, but because of the courage and dignity with which she has faced them. We will marry as planned, with joy and without apology. Those who choose to celebrate our happiness are welcome to do so. Those who prefer to condemn us are free to look away. I remain your obedient servant, Alexander Blackwood, Duke of Blackmore. When the letter appeared in the Times the following morning, it created a sensation that exceeded even Alexander's expectations. London society was divided between those who admired his honesty and courage and those who were scandalized by his public admission of an irregular relationship. But as the days passed, it became clear that public opinion was shifting in their favor. The romantic nature of their story, the obvious sincerity of Alexander's feelings, and Vivian's dignified response to the scrutiny all combined to create sympathy rather than condemnation. "It seems," Lord Westbrook observed over dinner at his club, "that society has decided to embrace your romance rather than condemn it. The betting books are now taking wagers on whether your wedding will be the event of the season." Alexander smiled at the news, though his attention was focused on Vivian, who sat beside him with the quiet confidence of a woman who had faced her worst fears and emerged victorious. "And what do you think?" he asked her quietly. "Are you prepared to be the center of such attention?" "I am prepared to be your wife," Vivian replied simply. Everything else is just noise. As they sat together in Lord Westbrook's elegant dining room, surrounded by friends who had chosen to support their unconventional love story, Alexander reflected on how much had changed since that first night when he had claimed Vivian so publicly on the dance floor. They had faced scandal, threats, and social disapproval, but they had emerged stronger for having faced them together. Their love had been tested by fire and had proven itself genuine, lasting, and worth every risk they had taken to protect it. "Alexander," Vivian said softly, her hand finding his beneath the table, "do you ever regret it? Breaking your own rules, claiming me so publicly, risking everything for love?" "Never," Alexander replied without hesitation. "The only thing I regret is waiting so long to do it. You are worth every scandal, every whisper, every moment of uncertainty we have endured, even if it means spending the rest of our lives as the couple who defied convention." "Especially then," Alexander said, raising her hand to his lips, "I would rather be notorious for loving you than famous for anything else." As the evening wore on and their friends toasted their upcoming marriage, Vivian marveled at the journey that had brought them to this moment. She had begun as a woman desperate enough to accept a duke's protection, bound by rules that kept her forever in the shadows. She was ending as a woman who had claimed her right to love and be loved, who had stood beside the man she adored as he defied society itself to make her his duchess. The transformation was complete, and it was beautiful. The wedding of the Duke of Blackmore and Miss Vivian Hartwell was indeed the event of the season, attended by everyone who mattered in London society and several who merely wished they did. St. George's, Hanover Square, was filled to capacity with guests who had come to witness what the newspapers were calling the love match of the century. Vivian walked down the aisle on the arm of Lord Westbrook, who had graciously agreed to give her away in the absence of her father, wearing a gown of ivory silk that had been designed specifically for the occasion. The dress was elegant without being ostentatious, fashionable without being frivolous, perfect for a woman who was about to become a duchess through love rather than birth. But it was not the dress that drew gasps of admiration from the assembled guests. It was the radiant happiness that seemed to surround Vivienne like an aura, the joy that lit her face as she moved toward the man who was waiting for her at the altar. Alexander stood at the front of the church in his formal dress uniform, his expression a mixture of love, pride, and barely contained emotion as he watched his bride approach. 6 months ago, he had been a man trapped by duty and expectation, following rules that others had set for his life. Today, he was a man who had chosen his own path, who had claimed his own happiness despite every obstacle society had placed in his way. "Dearly beloved," the Archbishop began, his voice carrying clearly through the packed church, "we are gathered here today to witness the union of Alexander James Blackwood and Vivian Catherine Hartwell in holy matrimony." Indeed, as the ceremony proceeded, Vivian found herself thinking of the journey that had brought them to this moment, the cold rules that had once governed their relationship, the careful distance they had maintained, the gradual warming that had transformed duty into desire and desire into love. "Do you, Alexander James Blackwood, take Vivian Catherine Hartwell to be your lawfully wedded wife, to have and to hold, in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, for better or worse, until death do you part?" "I do," Alexander said, his voice strong and clear, his eyes never leaving Vivian's face. "Do you, Vivian Catherine Hartwell, take Alexander James Blackwood to be your lawfully wedded husband, to have and to hold, in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, for better or worse, until death do you part?" "I do," Vivian replied, her voice steady despite the emotion threatening to overwhelm her. "By the power vested in me by God and the Church of England, I now pronounce you husband and wife. You may kiss your bride." When Alexander kissed her, sealing their marriage with tenderness and passion, the church erupted in applause and cheers. The scandal that had once threatened to destroy them had been transformed into a celebration of love's triumph over convention. The wedding breakfast that followed was held at Blackmore House, where the gardens had been decorated with thousands of white roses, and the ballroom had been transformed into a fairy tale setting worthy of the romantic story that had captivated London society. "Your Grace," said Lady Morrison, approaching Vivian during the reception, "you look absolutely radiant. Marriage clearly agrees with you." "Thank you," Vivian replied, the title still sounding strange and wonderful on her ears. "I confess I am still adjusting to everything." "You will find your footing soon enough," Lady Morrison assured her, "and may I say, you have handled all the attention with remarkable grace. Not every woman could have weathered such scrutiny with such dignity." Dun. As the evening wore on, Vivian found herself surrounded by well-wishers, society matrons who had initially been skeptical but had been won over by the obvious sincerity of her love for Alexander, and younger women who saw in her story a hope that love might triumph over practical considerations in their own lives. "Your Grace," said a young lady who had been introduced as Miss Catherine Pemberton, Lord Pemberton's youngest daughter, "I wanted to thank you for showing us that it is possible to marry for love rather than duty. Your story has given me hope that I might find such happiness myself." Vivian smiled at the earnest young woman, remembering her own doubts and fears before Alexander had claimed her so publicly. "Love is always possible, Miss Pemberton. Sometimes it comes in ways we do not expect, but it is always worth waiting for, worth fighting for." As the reception wound down and the last guests departed, Alexander and Vivian found themselves alone in the garden, where they had shared so many significant moments. The same garden where he had first imposed his rules, where they had maintained their careful distance, where love had gradually grown, despite every obstacle they had placed in its path. "Any regrets?" Alexander asked, echoing the question he had posed so many times during their unconventional courtship. "Only one," Vivian replied with a mischievous smile. "I regret that we wasted so much time following rules that kept us apart. Think of all the kisses we missed, all the honest conversations we could have had." Alexander laughed, pulling her into his arms. "Then we shall have to make up for lost time, my dear wife." "Indeed we shall, my dear husband." As they stood together in the moonlit garden, surrounded by the roses that had witnessed their transformation from strangers bound by necessity to lovers united by choice, Vivian reflected on the truth she had learned through their journey together. Love was not always convenient. It did not always follow the rules that society set for it. But when it was real, when it was fought for and defended against all who would destroy it, love could transform any situation, overcome any obstacle, and create happiness beyond anything that duty or convention could provide. The Duke, who had once warned her not to touch him in public, had become the husband who claimed her before all the world. The woman who had once accepted the shadows had become the Duchess who stood proudly in the light. Their love story had begun with rules and restrictions, with careful distance and calculated indifference. It was ending with passion and partnership, with public devotion and private joy. "Alexander," Vivian said as they walked back toward the house that was now their shared home, "do you remember what you said to me that first night, about not touching you in public?" "I remember," Alexander replied, his arm tightening around her waist. "It was perhaps the most foolish rule I have ever imposed." "Indeed it was," Vivian agreed, "though I suppose it served its purpose. It made this moment all the more precious. This moment. This moment when I can touch you whenever I choose, when I can love you openly, when I can call you mine before all the world." Alexander stopped walking, turning to face her with an expression of such love and tenderness that it took her breath away. "You have always been mine, Vivienne. From the moment I saw you standing alone in that ballroom, from the first time you challenged my rules, from the instant I realized that all my careful control meant nothing compared to what I felt for you." "And you have always been mine," Vivian replied, reaching up to frame his face with her hands. "My Duke," my husband, my heart's desire." As they kissed beneath the stars, surrounded by the garden where their love had bloomed, both of them understood that they had found something rare and precious, a love that had survived every test, overcome every obstacle, and emerged stronger for having been challenged. The rules that had once governed their relationship were gone, replaced by the only rule that mattered: that love, when it was real and fought for and cherished, could conquer anything. They had chosen each other over duty, passion over propriety, love over everything else the world had to offer. And they had chosen well. If this tale of forbidden love, broken rules, and the courage to claim happiness, despite society's disapproval, touched your heart, please give this video a like and subscribe to our channel for more passionate historical romances. Share your thoughts in the comments below. Would you have defied convention for love? Could you have waited through months of cold distance for a chance at true happiness? Your engagement helps us bring you more stories where love conquers all obstacles and transforms the most impossible circumstances into fairy tale endings. Thank you for joining us in the ballrooms and gardens of London. And until our next romantic tale unfolds, remember that sometimes the most beautiful love stories begin when we have the courage to break the rules that keep us apart.